The secret of Korea's miracle of development. How can we apply Korea's miracle of development to us? Now I'll tell you the secret right away. Please subscribe and like. In 1953, when the Korean War ended, Korea was literally a ruin. On May 16, 1961, Park Chung-hee took power in a chaotic Korea through the 516 military coup. He wanted to overcome the political limitation of the regime's lack of legitimacy through economic development. The dispatch of troops to Vietnam was a decisive move that Park Chung-hee made in this situation. The duration of the war was 8 years and 8 months. A total of 300,000 troops were dispatched. At that time, the war with the Viet Minh Communist forces in Vietnam was intensifying day by day. At that time, during the Cold War, the United States began to intervene in the war to prevent the communization of Vietnam, and requested support from other rearguard countries. Accordingly, in September 1964, Korea dispatched troops to Vietnam for the first time. It was a non-combat unit of 140 people consisting of medical personnel and taekwondo instructors. However, after 3 months, Vietnam and the United States requested additional deployment. At that time, Korea, which had received a request for a second deployment from Vietnam, and the United States, considered it inevitable. In the 1960s, when anti-communism was the national policy, the Korean government thought that the deployment would strengthen the anti-communist consciousness of the people and unite anti-communist countries in Asia. It also believed that this was the way to protect Korea's security. Korea thought that Vietnam should not become communist. At that time, Vietnam, Germany, and Korea were 3 divided countries. Another problem was the US forces in Korea. After the Korean War, 2 divisions of the US forces in Korea were stationed in Korea, and they played a large part in Korea's security. However, the Korean government was concerned that if the dispatch of troops to Vietnam was refused, the US forces in Korea would withdraw. The US forces in Korea, which are important in relation to Korea's security. Even before that, the US government was mainly concerned about what to do with the US troops stationed in Korea. So there was concern that President Johnson might send the US troops stationed in Korea back to the US. Then, which troops and how much would be dispatched to Vietnam? Volunteer army. In other words, it is an opinion to dispatch an army composed of civilian volunteers to Vietnam. The first reason was the justification for dispatching troops to Vietnam. Since Korea did not have a military agreement with Vietnam, there was no legal basis or obligation to dispatch regular troops. Moreover, Korea's military power at the time was not enough to support other countries. 15 years had passed since the Korean War. The standoff with North Korea was also serious. However, if volunteer troops were dispatched, the security burden could be reduced. Economic benefits were also considered in the dispatch of volunteer troops. Unemployment was a serious social problem at the time. And dispatching volunteer troops could be an effective measure to solve this problem. We thought that if we sent combat troops with experience in the Korean War to Vietnam, in a situation where unemployment was severe, this would be foreign currency. Also, from the military's perspective, it was strategically considered that troops who had actually fought in the Korean War could easily carry out the war. In January 1565, the Korean government was seriously considering sending volunteer troops to Vietnam. It was a realistic plan considering Korea's security and economic situation at the time. At the time, Korea made steady diplomatic efforts to join the UN. However, it was concerned that if it sent troops to the Vietnam War, which was being criticized worldwide, it would be difficult to gain support from other UN member states. So, a proposal was made to send volunteer troops, that is, civilian volunteer units, instead of regular troops, to reduce responsibility for the dispatch. However, what the government actually submitted to the National Assembly was the dispatch of 2,000 regular troops, including the Construction Engineering Support Corps and its own security unit. Why didn't President Park Chung-hee and other policy decision-makers at the time choose this volunteer troop dispatch plan? First, it was an international good faith to repay the help of the Free Allies who saved Korea during the Korean War. Second, if Vietnam were to become communist, the ripple effect would affect not only Southeast Asia but also Korea. Third, there were 3 major justifications to help the United States, which was a security ally, and to strengthen ties with the United States. However, regardless of the justification, it was difficult for the troop dispatch bill to pass the National Assembly. This was because, unlike the first dispatch, which was for humanitarian reasons. It was a full-scale dispatch of troops. However, some members of the National Assembly proposed a volunteer army as an alternative to dispatching troops. Citing security issues, they argued that the people would be convinced if they dispatched volunteer troops. However, the Korean government's position was that dispatching volunteer troops was impossible. The reasons were that they were less efficient than regular troops, difficult to control, and complicated compensation issues when casualties or missing persons occurred. Regarding the issue of dispatching troops to Vietnam, the Korean government also had to consider the position of the United States. At the time, the United States was not receiving support from the international community for its intervention in the Vietnam War. This was a huge burden for the Johnson administration. At the time, the international perception of the Vietnam War was, firstly, indifference, and secondly, opposition to direct U.S. intervention in the war was based on the perception that the Vietnam War was an internal war between nations. In order to turn public opinion at home and abroad that was critical of the war, the United States began to urge support from its allies. U.S. President Johnson sent personal letters to 25 countries around the world, asking them to help South Vietnam. However, only a few countries, including Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines, responded to the request for support. In this situation, if even Korea did not send regular troops, it would not have been of much help in demonstrating the legitimacy of the war, which was the goal that the United States had sought to achieve through the participation of its allies. When they came in the form of volunteer troops, they could have been treated as a group of vagrants or a group trying to make money. However, if they were sent as regular troops, they would have been recognized as a military measure based on Korea-U.S. relations, so they could have a national justification. In the end, considering these various situations, President Park Chung-hee did not insist on sending volunteer troops. In the end, the plan to send volunteer troops was not realized. And on January 28, 1965, the National Assembly passed the bill to dispatch the Pigeon Unit. God will surely bless and grant glory to you, the Crusaders of Freedom. I wish you good luck and success. From the farewell speech of President Park Chung-hee for the Pigeon Unit. On February 14, 1965, the Dove Unit farewell ceremony was held at Seoul Stadium with many citizens in attendance. The second dispatch of the Korean Army to Vietnam, the Korean Army's participation in the Vietnam War that had lasted for over 10 years, began in earnest. The U.S. Army suffered repeated defeats in battles against the North Vietnamese Army, and on February 27, 1965, about 20 days after the departure of the Dove Unit, a major U.S. military base was attacked by the Viet Cong. After this, the U.S. began to deploy large-scale troops to the Vietnam War, and strongly requested additional dispatch from Korea. It was also a request to send combat units, not non-combat units as before. Then, what was the position of the Korean government on this? The dispatch of troops is inevitable, but it should take the form of a congressional troop. And they should receive sufficient compensation. This was the unchanging position of the Korean government. Furthermore, Korea and the United States began persistent negotiations regarding the dispatch of combat troops. What were the diplomatic negotiations between Korea and the United States surrounding the dispatch of combat troops? On May 16, 1965, President Park Chung-hee arrived in the United States. U.S. President Johnson even sent his private plane to invite President Park. On this day, the streets of Washington, decorated with the American and Korean flags, were lined with countless citizens. And they unanimously welcomed President Park as he arrived in the city center. After President Park arrived in Washington, U.S. President Johnson joined him in a street parade and held a grand welcoming ceremony, declaring President Park his wife's day. It was an unprecedented courtesy that is hard to find in Korea-U.S. relations. The leaders of the two countries held two meetings. What was discussed during those meetings? On the first day of the talks, the first thing President Johnson brought up was the issue of additional troop dispatch to Vietnam. This was the reason he invited President Park Chung-hee. However, President Park did not give an immediate answer. Instead, he mentioned Korea's economic problems and requested aid from the United States. Then, President Johnson of the United States said that sending troops to Vietnam was necessary in order to pass the Korea-Vietnam dual plan in Congress, and even suggested a specific scale of one combat division. However, despite President Johnson's repeated requests, President Park did not promise to dispatch troops. It is said that there was prior communication with the Korean Minister of Defense who accompanied him on his visit to the United States. The United States was gradually reducing aid to Korea. At first, the United States provided $250 million in supplies to the Korean Ministry of National Defense. But it was going to reduce it by $50 million per year. As the Korean economy grew little by little, the United States was going to reduce aid by that amount. As a result, the defense budget continued to increase, but the treatment of Korean soldiers was very poor. At that time, it was difficult to accept the US's cut-off of defense support in Korea's economic situation. And the issue of Korea sending combat troops to Vietnam could be an effective card for this. The day after the summit, the Korean Minister of National Defense met with the US Secretary of Defense and requested economic aid. The US, which desperately needed to send combat troops, had no choice but to accept Korea's request. Shouldn't the Korean soldiers live in such a difficult situation while they are fighting in Vietnam? So that we can live like human beings, the US should not reduce aid to us while Korea is sending troops to Vietnam, but should just provide aid as before. With that aid money, we should also increase the salaries of Korean soldiers. Then the US Secretary of Defense said, okay. He said that the US would continue to provide aid during the period of dispatch, so that the money could be used to improve the treatment of Korean soldiers. Through these negotiations, the ROK-US joint statement was finally announced on May 19. The statement included most of the conditions that South Korea had been demanding, including a review of the US aid reduction policy, immediate US intervention and military support in the event of a North Korean re-invasion, provision of loans and expansion of exports to the US, and support for the establishment of KIST. And 2 months after President Park returned from her visit to the US, the State Council decided on the dispatch of combat troops. However, an unexpected situation occurred during the process of seeking National Assembly approval. A member of the National Assembly who was a member of the ruling Republican Party and a confidant of President Park, came out against the dispatch of troops to Vietnam. What was the background here? The opposition of the National Assembly member to the dispatch of troops was in accordance with President Park's instructions. It was a kind of play to lead the working-level negotiations with the United States more favorably. Around this time, news came that the United States had ordered military supplies for the Vietnam War from Japan. The National Assembly began to argue against sending troops because Japan, which had not sent a single soldier to Vietnam, was taking advantage of the special circumstances of the war. Korea was furious because it was doing all the work and the Japanese were making the money. So public opinion arose that at least Korea should receive compensation from the other party if it is going to fight together while risking its life. The United States was taken aback by the unexpected opposition to the dispatch of troops. And through the US Embassy in Korea, they conveyed a promise to completely stop reducing aid during the period of the dispatch of Korean troops. The request to allow the supply of military supplies for the Vietnam War was also accepted. The controversy surrounding the dispatch of combat troops in the National Assembly continued for a month. After all this pain, the dispatch bill was finally passed on August 13, 1965. And 2 months later, the advance party of the Tiger Unit departed for Vietnam. This was the third dispatch of Korean troops and the first dispatch of combat troops, 8 months after the sending of the Pigeon Unit to Vietnam. Behind this was the persistent diplomatic negotiations of the Korean government. The Tiger and Blue Dragon units dispatched at this time were elite units that were ranked first and second in the battle order. They were deployed to the battlefield and achieved many victories, and through active support for the people, they left a good impression on the Vietnamese people. This led to the US's continued request for the dispatch of Korean troops. In the end, Korea sent 8 units and 300,000 young people to Vietnam. Compared to the 50,000 Korean troops in 1966, when the Australian troops were 4,500. The New Zealand troops were 150, and the Thai troops were only 17, the scale was enormous. What did Korea gain from its 10-year participation in the Vietnam War until the end of 1973? The combat allowance paid by the US to the Korean troops after the second dispatch was also an important subject of negotiation. Before that, only mobile hospitals and taekwondo instructors were dispatched. So I didn't pay much attention to them, but this time, they are sending an engineer battalion and infantry guarding it, about 2,000 people. So I started to negotiate with the US in earnest about safety, where to station them, and what kind of treatment they should receive. The memorandum sent by the commander of the U.S. forces in Korea in 1964 contains the details of the combat pay for the Korean troops deployed to Vietnam. According to this, a colonel was to receive $6.50 per day, and a private first class was to receive $1 per day. If this is calculated as annual income, it is $360. It was 3 times the GNP per capita at the time. And most of this money was remitted to Korea. Just 1 month after sending the combat troops, the US again requested additional deployment through the US ambassador to Korea. Korea began more specific negotiations. Korea presented the conditions for the deployment to the US ambassador to Korea, and asked him to document them. This is what was obtained as the Brown Memorandum. In this memorandum written by the US ambassador to Korea on behalf of the US government, it guaranteed support for the modernization of the Korean military, burden of expenses for additional deployment, and improved treatment of soldiers deployed to Vietnam. In addition, during the period of dispatch, it promised to stop the reduction of aid and to purchase all equipment, supplies, etc. of the Korean troops dispatched to Vietnam from Korea. Provide equipment for the modernization of the Korean military. Cover the equipment and finances necessary for dispatching troops to Vietnam. Double the compensation for deaths or injuries in Vietnam. Accordingly, Korea began producing military supplies such as uniforms and combat rations to be issued to the dispatched troops. Korean-style combat rations containing canned kimchi were produced. By participating in various vested interests including military supplies exports, Korea was able to secure a breakthrough in exports. Exports, which were only $6.4 million in 1964, increased to $24 million in 2 years. Everything the Korean military needed in Vietnam, made in Korea, was supplied in Korea. Military uniforms, military boots, all facilities, barracks, airfields, and even rice were supplied. The modernization of the Korean military was also achieved through the dispatch of troops to Vietnam. According to the Brown Memorandum, the United States provided Korea with the latest aircraft, tanks, destroyers, and other equipment. For the first time since its foundation, an armored brigade was established in Korea, and new fighter jets were deployed to the Air Force. In return for sending troops to Vietnam, Korea was able to modernize its military and strengthen its national defense capabilities. Korea demanded that there be countermeasures to the imbalance of power that would occur in the situation of confrontation with North Korea. It demanded modern military equipment from the United States. The Gyeongbu Expressway, which was a symbol of economic development, opened in 1970, when the Vietnam War was in full swing. A large portion of the enormous cost of constructing the expressway was loans from the United States. Economic aid from the United States was given on the condition of sending troops to Vietnam. This played a major role in improving Korea's poor industrial structure and laying the foundation for economic growth. The profits that Korean companies made were also significant. In the early 1960s, the annual sales of a Korean cargo handling company that had advanced into Vietnam amounted to $7.25 million. Accounting for 13% of the total domestic service industry income at the time. The advancement of Korean companies into Vietnam also had the effect of solving the unemployment problem that was a serious problem in our society at the time. This was because Korean companies that had advanced into the cargo handling and construction sectors sent many workers to Vietnam. The number of POW technicians reached 25,000 after 1966. The Korean economy grew rapidly as it participated in the Vietnam War. In 1965, when the full-scale POW began, Korea's GNP was $30 million. But in 1972, it reached $100 million, more than 3 times that. Our companies that had received civil engineering technology were able to advance directly into Vietnam, and the dollars they earned as a result, and the technology transfers from the United States, laid the foundation for Korea's economic growth. Until the withdrawal from Vietnam began in 1973, 300,000 young Koreans risked their lives and fought in Vietnam. Their sacrifices became the driving force behind Korea's economic development. Korea's economic achievements through dispatching troops to Vietnam. The so-called Vietnam Special is the most highly regarded part when talking about that time. However, that was not all that the Park Chung-hee regime gained from dispatching troops to Vietnam. By deciding to dispatch troops to Vietnam while the entire world was critical of the war, President Park was able to strengthen relations with the United States, and through the full-scale aid from the United States, laid the foundation for economic development. The national income per capita was around $100. In Korea at the time, when the slogan "Let's live well" was more persuasive than anything else. This led to the people's trust in President Park. Through dispatching troops to Vietnam, President Park was able to overcome the political weakness of seizing power through a coup d'état, and laid the foundation for long-term rule. But was this result obtained by chance? We have thought that the dispatch of troops to Vietnam was carried out at the unilateral request of the United States, and that the results were the price paid for it. The dispatch of troops to Vietnam played a decisive role in stabilizing the Park Chung-hee regime. However, there was another truth behind it. November 14, 1961. The attention of both Korea and the world was focused on President Park Chung-hee's visit to the United States. 6 months after seizing power through the May 16 coup, Chairman Park Chung-hee met with U.S. President Kennedy. At the time, the United States had a strong influence on Korean politics, and the meeting with U.S. President Kennedy was an important occasion for Chairman Park Chung-hee to gain recognition. However, there is an unexpected content in the minutes of the meeting that recorded the situation at the time. Chairman Park Chung-hee mentioned the dispatch of troops to Vietnam first while mentioning his experience in the Korean War. He emphasized his sense of responsibility as a member of the liberal world as the justification for dispatching troops. The Park Chung-hee military coup forces were greatly suspected by the United States. The core of the suspicion was that Park Chung-hee had experience in the socialist movement. Therefore, from Park Chung-hee's perspective, it would have been difficult to maintain power without the help of the United States. And it was difficult to secure foreign currency at the time. Therefore, there was a political intention to make up for the lack of legitimacy of the Park Chung-hee regime. Through the proposal to dispatch troops to Vietnam, Park Chung-hee was able to show his active support for American politics. U.S. President Kennedy was very satisfied with Chairman Park's proposal. However, at the time, the U.S. government was not considering the issue of dispatching Korean troops to Vietnam. Until now, the Kennedy administration had not intervened specifically in Vietnam. So there was no justification for accepting Korea's proposal to dispatch troops to Vietnam. U.S. President Kennedy responded that now was not the right time, so he could request it later if necessary. If necessary, he would discuss it through the U.S. ambassador to Korea. However, Chairman Park's proposal to dispatch troops was repeated. He revealed that the dispatch of troops to Vietnam was not an impromptu proposal, saying that he had already discussed this issue with the military generals before visiting the United States. In the early 1960s, when the Park Chung-hee government was launched, the government at the time had 3 immediate tasks. First, to gain the trust of the United States and ensure the stability of the regime. Second, to prevent an invasion by North Korea. And third, to solve the country's difficult economic problems. It was very important to solve these 3 problems, and the dispatch of troops to Vietnam was the solution to all 3. Therefore, Park Chung-hee did his best to realize the dispatch of troops to Vietnam. The dispatch of the Vietnam Military Inspection Group, which was reported as a scoop in the Kyungyang Shinmun on May 12, 1962. This was also done by Park Chung-hee's will. At that time, Park Chung-hee created a military inspection team for Vietnam, with about 10 high-ranking officers above the rank of colonel, and provided education on Vietnam for 2 months. Then, on the night of May 11th, he sent them to Vietnam in secret on a special plane. Why did Park Chung-hee dispatch a military inspection team to Vietnam? Chairman Park Chung-hee instructed the military inspection team, leaving for Vietnam, to look into Vietnam in detail and examine the possibility of sending Korean troops. The plan to send troops to Vietnam proposed by the inspection team at that time even took into account the sentiments of the Vietnamese people who were wary of other countries intervening in the war. Since it was a non-combat unit, the Vietnamese people would not resist much. So a Taekwondo instructor was sent, and Taekwondo became very active in Vietnam. Also, a mobile hospital went to Vietnam and treated many patients. So the Vietnamese people welcomed it very well.
After establishing specific procedures for dispatching troops to Vietnam, President Park began serious discussions with government officials. It is said that in August 1963, he summoned the military leaders to the presidential villa, expressed his intention to dispatch troops to Vietnam, and asked for the military's opinion. At that time, President Park Chung-hee and the military leaders were worried about the bleak future of Korea. I thought it was time to take a drastically different approach. I thought that if we continued like this, we would end up as a hopeless country in a corner of Northeast Asia. At that time, everyone present shared the same sentiment that we should take action. Around this time, the assassination of U.S. President Kennedy occurred. And in January 1964, U.S. President Johnson took office. The U.S. policy, which had been passive toward Vietnam, also began to change. It was decided to end the Vietnam War through military intervention. The Korean government, which had been paying attention to this change in the United States, once again conveyed its intention to dispatch troops to Vietnam through Ambassador to the United States Kim Hyun-chul. If the United States requests it, Korea can send 3,000 to 4,000 troops to Vietnam. 6 months later, the so-called Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred, in which a U.S. destroyer was attacked. This became a decisive turning point for the U.S. to expand the war. On the other side of the globe, in Southeast Asia, we, the U.S., were intentionally attacked provocatively. Since peace was clearly demanded, we took swift and accurate retaliatory measures. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the U.S. launched a large-scale air raid on the Vietnam War. However, the war did not end easily due to the fierce resistance and guerrilla tactics of the Viet Minh, which promoted nationalism. In the end, the U.S. requested support from free allies. And in September 1964, the first dispatch of Korean troops to Vietnam took place. September 11, 1964. 130 mobile hospital personnel and 10 Taekwondo instructors dispatched to Vietnam. It was a change that was intertwined with Park Chung-hee's continued will and changes in international politics. From the perspective of the Republic of Korea, the benefit we gained was participation in the Vietnam War, the only breakthrough in a country where foreign currency procurement was impossible and the legitimacy of the regime was lacking. Participation in the Vietnam War was very structured and planned. Most of the planned negotiations were successful. President Park Chung-hee, who took power through a coup d'état, he wanted to overcome the political limitations of the regime's lack of legitimacy through economic development. The dispatch of troops to Vietnam was a decisive move that Park Chung-hee chose in this situation. President Park Chung-hee, who thought of the Vietnam War as the only opportunity, he effectively used the card of dispatching troops to Vietnam. However, behind the scenes, we also lost a lot. As many as 5,000 young Koreans lost their lives in Vietnam, and there are still veterans in our society who are suffering from the aftereffects of that war. Furthermore, despite their sacrifices, Korea could not avoid international criticism for its participation in the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War that shook the world from the 1960s to the early 1970s. Park Chung-hee, who was the leader of Korea at the time, made a decision to take advantage of the international public opinion, opposing the war and the practical position of seeking compensation for dispatching troops to Vietnam. The evaluation of whether that choice was the right one is still important today. Justification and practicality. In international relations where the two fiercely coexist, we always have to choose something, and the responsibility for that is ours.